9-year-old Lily froze mid-step, one boot hovering over a bed of dry pine needles. The woods behind her house were usually filled with the chatter of squirrels and the call of blue jays, but this sound was different. It wasn't a bird. It was a low, desperate whimper that cut through the cooling evening air like a serrated blade. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to reach for her. She pushed aside a heavy branch of briars, ignoring the thorns that snagged her jeans, and there it was. A puppy, tangled deep in the undergrowth, shaking so violently the leaves around it trembled. It looked up at her with eyes wide with terror. Lily dropped to her knees, reaching out to check for a tag on its collar, completely unaware that the words she was about to read would force her to run for her life. To understand why Lily didn't run immediately, you have to understand who she was. Most 9-year-olds were afraid of the deep woods, especially when the light began to fail and the temperature dropped. But Lily was different. She was a child of the forest, observant and deeply connected to the rhythm of the wild. She knew the difference between the rustle of a deer and the heavy tread of a bear. She knew which berries were sweet and which would make your stomach turn. These woods were her sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world faded into a peaceful hum. But today, that peace was broken. The silence wasn't the comfortable quiet of nature resting. It was heavy, suffocating, and wrong. It felt as though the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. She moved slowly toward the source of the sound, her small boots making no noise on the damp earth. The puppy was a golden retriever mix, but you would hardly know it from the state of him. He was a creature of mud and misery, his golden fur matted with burrs and dried blood. He was so malnourished that his ribs looked like the rungs of a ladder beneath his skin. When he saw Lily, he didn't wag his tail, he didn't yip for joy. He pressed himself flatter against the ground, baring his teeth in a silent snarl that was born of pure fear. This wasn't a stray who had wandered off a porch. This was an animal who had learned that human hands meant pain. Lily stopped 10 feet away. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her instinct took over. She knew that rushing him would only make him bolt, or bite. Slowly, deliberately, she sat down in the dirt, crossing her legs. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the half-eaten turkey sandwich she had saved from lunch. The foil crinkled loudly in the stillness, and the puppy flinched, his ears pinning back against his skull. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind in the leaves. "I'm not going to hurt you." She tore off a small piece of turkey and tossed it gently. It landed a few feet from his nose. The puppy stared at it, then at her, his body rigid. Hunger warred with terror in his dark eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The shadows stretched longer, turning the green of the forest into shades of gray and black. Finally, the puppy's nose twitched. The scent of the meat was too strong to resist. He crawled forward, belly dragging in the dirt, and snapped up the food. Lily didn't move. She threw another piece, closer this time, then another. With every inch he moved toward her, she saw more of the damage. The raw patches of skin on his flanks, the way he favored his left paw. It broke her heart, but she kept her face calm, offering nothing but patience. It took 20 minutes for him to bridge the gap, but finally he was close enough that she could hear his ragged breathing. He sniffed her boot, then her knee. When he didn't pull away, Lily slowly lowered her hand, letting him smell her scent. He didn't bite. Instead, he let out a long, shuddering sigh and collapsed against her leg, his energy spent. The heat from his small, trembling body soaked through her jeans. Lily gently rested her hand on his head, her fingers working through the dirty, matted fur. She felt the sharp ridge of his spine and the frantic beat of his heart slowing down as he realized he was safe. But as her hand moved down to his neck to check for a tag, her fingers brushed against something that felt wrong. It wasn't the smooth nylon of a pet store collar. It was thick, rigid, and cold. She leaned in, squinting in the dying light to see what he was wearing. It was a heavy strap of industrial leather, crude and ugly, secured not with a buckle, but with twisted wire that dug into his skin. And taped to the inside of that leather band was something that made her stomach tighten, a detail that turned this from a rescue into a warning. Lily's fingers traced the cold metal wire, her breath hitching in her throat. This wasn't just a collar, it was a shackle. The leather was thick and stiff, the kind used for heavy machinery belts rather than pet accessories, and it smelled faintly of motor oil and stale, damp earth. Someone had punched crude holes through the tough material with a nail or an awl, threading the jagged wire through to twist it shut. There was no buckle to release, no way to slide it off over the puppy's ears without cutting him. Every time the little dog moved his head, the raw edges of the leather rubbed against skin that was already pink and irritated. She moved her hands slowly, trying to find a way to loosen the tension without hurting him further. The puppy remained frozen, his large brown eyes fixed on her face, searching for any sign of the cruelty he had clearly come to expect. Lily murmured soft, nonsensical reassurances, her fingers working delicately at the twisted knot of wire. It was tight, angry work, done by hands that didn't care about comfort or safety. As she shifted the leather band just an inch to relieve the pressure on his throat, her thumb brushed against a strange lump on the inside surface of the collar. It felt out of place, a rectangular bulge hidden between the leather and the dog's neck. Lily frowned, tilting the puppy's head gently toward the fading light. A strip of clear packing tape had been slapped haphazardly against the inner lining, sealing a small, folded object against the leather. It was hidden perfectly. No one would see it unless they were close enough to touch the animal, close enough to care. Curiosity warred with a rising sense of dread. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves around them, sending a chill through her thin jacket that had nothing to do with the temperature. With trembling fingers, she picked at the edge of the tape. It peeled back with a sticky, tearing sound that seemed too loud in the quiet forest. Beneath the plastic was a scrap of paper, damp from the puppy's sweat and the humidity of the woods. It was small, torn perhaps from the corner of a grocery bag or a cheap notebook, folded over itself 3 times until it was no bigger than a stamp. Lily unfolded it. The paper was fragile, threatening to disintegrate in her hands. In the dim gray light, she squinted at the message scrawled in the center. The handwriting was shaky, the letters jagged and uneven, written with a pencil that had been pressed down so hard the lead had nearly torn through the page. "Help us. Old sawmill. They took the others." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. The old sawmill. Every kid in town knew about the sawmill, but not because they went there. It was a place of local legend and parental warnings, a decaying industrial skeleton 3 miles east, buried deep in the overgrown valley where the logging road ended. The adults said the structures were unstable, filled with rusted blades and rotting floors that could swallow a person whole. It was a place where sunlight seemed to die before it hit the ground, a prohibited zone surrounded by chain-link fences that had long since been breached by rust and time. But the note spoke of something worse than structural decay. They took the others. Lily's mind raced, connecting dots she hadn't realized were there. For months, the community bulletin board outside the grocery store had been layered with missing pet flyers. It started with the miller's prize-winning beagle, then the stray cats that lived behind the diner, and then Mrs. Higgins's Labrador. People blamed coyotes, they blamed the harsh winter, they blamed the busy highway. But coyotes didn't put industrial collars on their prey. Coyotes didn't leave frantic notes begging for help. She looked down at the puppy, really seeing him for the first time. He wasn't just a lost dog, he was an escapee. He was proof. Someone was holding animals at the old sawmill, keeping them in conditions bad enough to warrant a desperate, secret message smuggled out on the neck of the only one small enough to squeeze through a hole in the fence. A cold realization settled in her stomach, heavier than the fear she had felt earlier. If this puppy had escaped, then the people who put the collar on him, the people who took the others, would be looking for him. They wouldn't just let their property vanish into the woods. They would be hunting. And right now, sitting in the open with the evidence in her hand, Lily wasn't just a girl helping a stray. She was the only thing standing between an innocent creature and the monsters who wanted him back. The woods, once her sanctuary, suddenly felt very big, very dark, and very unsafe. The forest, usually Lily's playground, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and threats. The note felt heavy in her pocket, a burning secret that demanded action. But panic was a cold, paralyzing weight in her chest. She knew she had to move. Every second she spent standing still was a second the sun dipped lower, stealing the last of her visibility. Her house was less than a mile away if she took the deer trail that cut through the valley, but that path ran dangerously close to the overgrown access road leading to the old sawmill. The alternative was the long way around, hiking back up the ridge to the main highway, but that would take an hour she didn't have. She looked down at the puppy. He was trying to stand, his legs wobbling like loose sticks, but he collapsed back into the leaves with a soft groan. he couldn't walk. If they were going to get out of here, she would have to carry him. Lily didn't hesitate. She knelt and scooped him up, gritting her teeth as the dead weight of the animal settled into her arms. He was heavier than he looked, a dense bundle of bone and matted fur, but he didn't struggle. He pressed his face into the crook of her neck, his breathing shallow and rapid against her skin. Lily took a step, then another, moving as quietly as she could through the brush. The dry leaves under her boots sounded like gunshots in the silence. She tried to stick to the mossy patches, her eyes darting between the trees, scanning for movement. She had made it perhaps 50 yards when a sound stopped her heart cold. It was a low mechanical rumble, distant at first, then growing louder, a rhythmic crunching of gravel. Tires. Vehicles never came this deep into the woods. The logging trails had been closed for a decade, blocked by fallen trees and rusted gates. The only reason a truck would be out here, crawling along the spine of the valley at twilight, was if it was going to the sawmill. Lily didn't think. She reacted. She spotted the massive upturned root ball of a fallen oak tree 10 feet to her left, a natural fortress of dirt and tangled wood. She dove behind it, curling her body into a tight ball, pulling the puppy into her chest to shield him. She pressed her back against the rotting bark, squeezing her eyes shut as the sound grew deafening. A vehicle crested the hill on the old logging road just 30 yards away. Through a gap in the roots, Lily saw it. It was an old, battered pickup truck, its paint stripped away by rust and time, looking like a bruise against the darkening forest. It moved slowly, prowling like a predator. Mounted on the passenger side was a high-powered spotlight, its beams slicing through the trees, sweeping back and forth across the undergrowth. The beam hit the canopy above them, illuminating the branches in stark, blinding white before swinging down toward the forest floor. Lily held her breath, her lungs burning. The light swept over the fallen oak, pausing for a terrifying second on the upturned roots before moving on. But it wasn't the truck that terrified her most. It was the puppy. The moment the engine's rumble had reached them, the dog had gone completely rigid in her arms. He didn't shake, he didn't whimper, he turned to stone. His heart, which had been slowing down, was now hammering against her chest so hard she thought it might bruise them both. This wasn't general fear of a loud noise. This was recognition. He knew that engine. He knew the sound of those tires on the gravel. These were the men who had bound him in wire. These were the men who had taken the others. The truck didn't continue past them. With a squeal of brakes that echoed through the valley, it came to a halt at the fork in the road, the exact spot where Lily's trail intersected with the gravel path. The engine dropped to a menacing idle, chugging like a dying beast. Lily's stomach dropped. They weren't just passing through. They were stopping at the trailhead. They were blocking the only fast route to her house. If she tried to cross the road now, the spotlight would catch her instantly. If she tried to run back up the ridge, the noise would give her away. She was trapped in the wedge of woods between the hunters and their destination, with 40 pounds of evidence trembling in her arms and the sun gone from the sky. The safety of her home felt a million miles away. She was on their turf now. Lily knew she couldn't stay behind the fallen oak. The truck idling at the trailhead was a gatekeeper, barring the only safe passage back to her world. To go forward, she had to go backward. She had to circle deeper into the woods, cutting through the dense, untamed brush that bordered the sawmill's perimeter, to bypass the men and loop back toward the main highway from the east. It was a terrifying calculation. Moving closer to the monster's lair was the only way to escape its claws. She adjusted her grip on the puppy, hoisting him higher against her chest. His warmth was the only comforting thing in a world that had turned cold and hostile. She slipped away from the road, stepping delicately into the thicket of rhododendrons and briars. The darkness here was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that swallowed the shapes of the trees. Lily navigated by memory and touch, her boots finding purchase on the slick, leaf-covered slope. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. The puppy, though small for his breed, felt like he was made of lead. His dead weight dragged at her shoulders, making her arms scream with lactic acid burn. Every few steps, a thorny vine would lash out from the dark, snagging her jeans or scratching thin, stinging lines across her cheeks. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting iron. She couldn't stop. If she stopped, the fear would catch up to her, and her legs would refuse to move again. She was fueled by a desperate, primal need to protect the trembling life in her arms. After 20 minutes of grueling climbing, the ground leveled out. Lily recognized the terrain. She had reached the limestone ridge that formed a natural amphitheater above the valley floor. She crept forward, crouching low as the trees thinned, revealing the source of the dread that permeated these woods. She was looking directly down into the old sawmill. It wasn't the abandoned ruin everyone thought it was. It was alive with a sinister, industrial energy. Portable floodlights, rigged on tall poles and powered by the humming generator she had heard earlier, bathed the central muddy yard in a harsh, sickly yellow glare. The light carved long, dancing shadows against the rusted, corrugated metal of the main warehouse. But it was what filled the yard that made Lily's breath hitch in her throat. Rows of makeshift kennels lined the perimeter. Chain-link runs covered with heavy blue tarps to hide them from aerial view. They were packed tight, a shantytown of misery. And inside them were the others. Lily squinted against the glare, tears blurring her vision. She saw a beagle pacing in tight, neurotic circles, its tail tucked between its legs. She saw a pair of spaniels huddled together in the mud, shivering. She saw a massive German shepherd lying motionless, staring at the fence with hollow, broken eyes. These weren't strays. They weren't wild dogs. Even from this distance, she could see the glint of metal tags reflecting the floodlights. She saw bright red collars, pink bandanas, and groomed coats that were now matted with filth. These were pets. They were the missing family members from the flyers at the grocery store. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a professional theft ring. These men were stealing the town's heart, one animal at a time, hoarding them in this damp, freezing hellhole to sell or breed. The scale of it was nauseating. There were dozens of them. And the silence, that was the worst part. Why weren't they barking? Why weren't they howling for their owners? Fear had silenced an entire choir of animals. Lily shifted her weight, her leg cramping from the crouch. She needed to leave. She needed to get to the sheriff. She placed her boot carefully on a patch of moss to turn around. Crack! The sound was like a gunshot in a library. A dry, brittle branch, hidden beneath the moss, snapped loudly under her weight. The noise echoed off the limestone ridge, cutting through the hum of the generator with terrifying clarity. Below her, the heavy metal door of the warehouse slammed open. Two men stepped out into the yellow light. One was tall, wearing a grease-stained jacket. The other held a long catch-pole. The tall man froze, his head snapping up toward the ridge where Lily was crouched. He raised a heavy flashlight, its beam slicing upward through the darkness, searching. "Did you hear that?" His voice carried up the slope, rough and angry. "Probably a deer," the other grunted, spitting into the mud. "Deer don't snap branches like that," the first man growled. He unclipped a radio from his belt. "Check the perimeter. Someone's up on the ridge." Lily didn't wait to see the man start climbing. The moment the beam of light swept toward the ridge, she scrambled backward into the brush. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins, washing away the fatigue. She clutched the puppy so tight against her chest she could feel his heart hammering against her own, a frantic rhythm that matched her terrifying reality. Behind her, the heavy crash of boots on rock echoed up the slope. He was coming, and he was fast. She knew she couldn't outrun him. He was a grown man. She was a child, carrying a dead weight in boots that were 2 sizes too small. If she tried to sprint for the road, he would catch her before she made the tree line. She had to disappear. She had to become part of the woods. She veered left, throwing herself down a steep embankment that led toward the creek. The slope was slick with wet leaves and loose shale. Her feet went out from under her instantly. She slid 10 feet on her hip, the rough ground tearing at her jeans, mud slicking her hands. But she never let go of the dog. She curled around him like a shield, taking the brunt of every root until they hit the ravine bottom. The footsteps above stopped. "I heard it over here!" a voice shouted, rough and dangerously close. Lily scrambled onto her hands and knees. The creek bed was a graveyard of old trees. She spotted a massive sycamore hanging over the water, its roots carved out by years of flooding to create a dark hollow beneath the bank. She dove into the cavity, dragging her legs in tight. The mud was freezing, seeping instantly through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. She pressed her back against the wet earth and pulled the puppy's head into her jacket, burying his snout in the wool of her sweater. "Shh," she breathed, the sound barely a ghost of a whisper. "Don't make a sound." The puppy trembled violently, his body a vibrating wire of terror, but he didn't whine. He seemed to understand. He froze, melting into her warmth. Above them, the brush cracked. The beam of the flashlight sliced down into the ravine, cutting through the darkness like a physical blade. It swept over the water, illuminating the floating leaves and the jagged rocks. Then it moved to the bank. Lily stopped breathing. She squeezed her eyes shut. The light hit the roots of the sycamore. It lingered there, blindingly bright, scorching the edges of her vision. She could hear the man's heavy breathing, the rustle of his jacket as he leaned over the edge, scanning the darkness. "See anything?" the voice from the sawmill shouted. The man above her grunted, kicking a loose stone down the slope. It splashed into the water inches from Lily's boot. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, willing her heart to stop beating so loud. If the puppy moved, if she gasped, if the wind shifted, it was over. "Nothing," the man spat, swinging the light away. "Probably a raccoon. Or that stray came back." "Leave it," the other voice yelled. "We got work to do. If the stray comes back, we'll put him in the pit with the others." The man hesitated for one agonizing second longer, his presence a heavy weight pressing down on the hollow. Then, finally, the crunch of boots retreated. Lily didn't move. She waited, counting the seconds in her head, letting the silence of the woods slowly bleed back in. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5. Only when the engine of the truck revved in the distance did she dare to exhale. The air burned her lungs. She uncurled her stiff, freezing limbs and crawled out. Her adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a shaking exhaustion. But fear was a powerful fuel. She looked back toward the east, where the faint orange glow of the highway streetlights stained the night sky. It was miles away, uphill, through the dark. "We're going home, Lucky," she whispered to the dog. He licked her chin, a tiny, rough gesture of thanks. Lily set her jaw, turned her back on the nightmare, and began to run. The tree line finally broke. Lily burst from the suffocating darkness of the woods onto the gravel shoulder of Highway 9. The transition from the silent, menacing forest to the open road was jarring. Her lungs burned as if she had swallowed fire, and the cold night air stung her scratched cheeks. She stumbled, her legs finally betraying her after miles of terror, and collapsed to her knees on the rough asphalt. She clutched the puppy to her chest, curling around him one last time as a pair of headlights swept around the curve. She didn't have the strength to stand. She waved her free arm frantically, a small, desperate shadow against the night. The car didn't speed past. It slowed, tires crunching heavily on the gravel, and the roof erupted in blue and red light. A sheriff's cruiser. Deputy Miller stepped out, his hand resting instinctively on his belt. His expression shifted from professional caution to absolute shock as he recognized the figure on the ground. "Lily? What on earth are you doing out here?" She couldn't speak. The words were stuck in her throat, blocked by the sob she had been holding back for an hour. Instead, she thrust the puppy toward him. In the harsh glare of the headlights, the industrial leather collar and the twisted wire looked barbaric, a stark contrast to the clean uniform of the officer. She pressed the damp, crumpled note into his hand. "Read it," she choked out, her voice cracking. "Please. They have the others." Miller looked at the crude shackle on the dog's neck, then at the terrified, mud-streaked child. He unfolded the paper. His jaw tightened as he read the shaky pencil scrawl. He didn't ask her if she was sure. He didn't tell her she was imagining things. He reached into the cruiser and grabbed the radio, his voice dropping an octave, deadly serious. "Dispatch, I need backup at the old Sawmill Access Road, Priority 1. Possible felony theft ring in progress. I have a witness and physical evidence. Send everyone." The next hour was a blur of chaotic light and sound. Lily sat in the back of Miller's cruiser, the door open, wrapped in a heavy thermal blanket. A paramedic carefully cut the wire from the puppy's neck, murmuring soft apologies as the metal came free. The paramedic applied a cooling gel to the raw skin, and for the first time, the puppy licked a human hand instead of flinching. Lily watched through the windshield as a convoy of police vehicles roared past, turning down the logging road she had just escaped. She heard the distant shouts, the crack of a gate being rammed, and the static-filled updates on Miller's radio. "Suspects in custody. We found the cages. Get the transport vans down here. There's dozens of them." The radio crackled again. "Secure the perimeter. We have evidence of interstate trafficking." The scale of what she had uncovered was massive. When the first animal control van rolled back up the hill, the silence of the valley was finally broken. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was a symphony of barking, excited, loud, and alive. Deputy Miller leaned into the car, a tired grin breaking his stoic face. "We got them, Lily. We got all of them." A familiar station wagon screeched to a halt behind the police line. Lily's parents scrambled out, their faces pale masks of terror that shattered into relief the moment they saw her. Her mother pulled her into a hug so tight it knocked the wind out of her again, sobbing into her hair. Her father stood over them, staring at the convoy of rescued dogs, then down at his daughter. He didn't speak. He just reached out and rested his hand on her head, his eyes shining with a pride that was fiercer than any anger. Lily buried her face in her mother's coat, but her hand never left the puppy's fur. The shivering had stopped, for both of them. 2 days later, the town community center was a sea of tears and wagging tails. Families were reunited with pets they thought were gone forever, hugging them as if they were children. The mayor handed Lily a plaque for bravery, speaking of heroism, but Lily barely heard him. She was too busy looking at Lucky, now bathed, fed, and resting his head on her sneaker. She didn't want a medal. She just wanted him home. If Lily's courage inspired you, hit like and share this story to remind the world to protect the vulnerable. Subscribe for more tales of hope.